Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 14, a deeper look into corrections. But yeah, sorry to harp on that, man. I didn't mean to keep bringing it up. So how about we dive into some good practices?
Yeah, let's go into good practices. And okay, good practices. So good practices would start off with strong foundation, kind of a great segue. So if we have a good foundation on our dogs, then pretty much we will only have to use correction as needed, or we can use them in moderation, right? The corrections in and of themselves should be rare, but they should be effective corrections, right? So if I've done a lot of food work, if I've done a lot of training, if I've done a lot of prep work, if I've done a lot of shaping with motivational tools, pretty much I should have done my best, or at least maxed out in the amount of time that I was training and scaffolding lesson plans to get as much focus from the dog as I possibly could have, right? Now, once I've done that, then we might see, let's say you've been able to reach 85 to 90% of the dog's focus. But there's that 10% of the dog's focus that's very difficult to get because the dog is a scent hound and he likes to put his nose to the ground, or the dog has a high prey drive. And every time you go to the park, anytime he hears a squeak, he takes a look to see where it's coming from, right? So in those scenarios, we should have very rare but effective corrections to be able to get our dogs back on task of whatever it is that we're trying to teach them, right? And so with very high, again, we see this in very high drive dogs, the use of corrections at the higher forms of training are actually really effective in sharpening certain skills. People in competition work, people in, protection sports use correction a lot, but definitely even in competitive obedience work, they use correction to start shaping certain things, which is interesting. But yeah, it takes a lot of prep work. It takes, corrections need to be very rare and effective. That's a good sign of it. We only need them as needed. How about you, man? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that I agree with all that, but I think that some stuff that I would like to add to, if we're talking good practices, proper tools, and proper tools vary. I believe in prong collars. I believe in e-collars. They're not always a one-size-fits-all approach. I've been a prong collar trainer for much longer than an e-collar trainer. Prong collars have tons of benefits, even some that like supersede e-collar stuff. But I meet lots of dogs that just do better on this versus that. Some do better on the prong, some do better on the e-collar. And it's our job to assess that as best we can, because sometimes just a small adjustment in the tool can make a world of difference. And sometimes that means backing down from intensity too. Like we talked about plastic star mark collars as opposed to like metal prong collars. Now, I've had foster dogs in the past that were very sensitive dogs, like feral dogs that weren't even used to having leashes on. And, but we're talking that dog with, months of training. So now it's like a full on trained dog, but still a sensitive kind of jumpy, like very like shepherdy dog. Now, prong collar worked, but you could see even with light pressure, it was like, mentally speaking, it was hitting the dog very hard. And we're talking like light pressure. So I backed him down to a star mark collar. Plastic, they're not as like potent in their correction, which can be good, right? Depending on the situation. Moved him onto that, and he works out amazingly well with that. So we keep him on that thing. And I think that proper tools can make a world of difference. Proper timing and intensity. I mean, that's really all of dog training in any facet ever. But if your timing or your intensity of your corrections are off, you are going to push your dog most likely into learned helplessness. Now you're probably doing more harm than good. So really try to dial that in as best you can. Right.
Well, on both sides of the spectrum too, because intensity could also be underwhelming as well.
Exactly. Right. That's why I didn't say like too much. It's just, it's improper. It can be this or that. You can be too early or too late. You can be too much, too little. It's definitely important to make sure that you're as on the money as you can be, and understanding again, I'm glad that you liked the idea of moving target, because it applies all the time. It's like, depending on the situation, depending on the tool and the owner and whatever's happening, correction, like, where in that space of time depends, and how intense your correction, it all depends. And it's our job to best find these moments in time and mark them as clearly as possible for the dog, and then take what we've learned and then convey that over to the owner so that they can pick it up and keep going with it for the rest of the dog's life.
Right. And I want to just bounce off of that and just say, like, proper timing and proper intensity and the use of proper tools and just becoming savvy. As dog trainers, we know these things take time to learn, right? And that's why it's so invaluable for you guys to have proper trainers actually helping you guys learn these skills, learn these tools.
Yes.
Because once you learn these skills and you learn these tools, you'll see vast differences, right? I think, and when you buy these tools out, at the pet store, they don't come with instructions. They don't come with a YouTube channel that you can look up and figure out actually the proper ways to use it or the proper practices. So, it's very easy to give overwhelming corrections, to have bad timing, to pick the wrong tool. But ultimately what the end goal of all of this is that if we do things properly, we use corrections to a minimum. We should always be rewarding dogs way more than we're correcting, right? It should at least be a 5-to-1, right? Like 5 times more positive reinforcement than there is correction. And that's just simply based on just happiness, right? That's simply based on, if we're correcting 50-50, well, that means the dog's not completely clear on what the right decision should be. Right. So that means we got to do more prep work. But ultimately our goal is to give the minimal amount of corrections as needed. But when we do give those corrections, give the appropriate type, whether it's a lure, whether it's a reminder, whether it's a correction, right? However you look at it, or whatever varying degrees in between, make sure that it fits the offense that your dog is doing.
Right.
And the end goal of any training practice, whether it be corrections, food, markers, whatever it is, it's eventually to phase out, to be able to use the technique with such potency that eventually you have the ability to phase out of that technique in and of itself, right? If you can phase out the use of corrections, you're doing well. If you can phase out the use of food, if you can phase out the use of markers, if you can phase out, any type of tool that you're using initially in training, that means you're doing a hell of a job in progressing your dogs to the next levels of training. If you can't, that means you need a little bit more work and help getting you there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's, I think that's where we largely agree. But my slight disagreement with you is, like, if a tool works, corrections wise, yes, I correct my dogs as absolutely little as I can. I mean, why not, right? I don't want to correct my dogs any more than I have to. And with proper training, of course, that propensity, that amount of time that I spend correcting will go down, and that's on me as an owner, 100%. But as far as like phasing out the tool, I stick with it. I think if my dog finds a tool that works, if it's a prong collar or e-collar or whatever, or a combo of the two or whatever the case, and they just work for me, if I'm not really correcting hardly ever anyway, but I know that if and when I have to, they work out, I'm more of the mindset of, like, I want owners to do whatever makes them not only like emotionally kind of feel the most in control, but also have the most control, like, should they ever need it. It's kind of like a seatbelt. I don't want the dog to be lunging, but if they do, just, I'd rather you be ready.
Right.
And just forget what what your neighbor thinks about the e-collar or whatever the case, because it's your job to keep your dog safe and healthy and happy and so on.